It was billed as a musical event extraordinary, featuring a military band without a rival, although one that had never performed in public before. When the night of the concert arrived, John Philip Sousa mounted the podium and faced his newly formed band of 50 of the highest-classed artists and soloists. But instead of launching into the first number on the program, the men rose to their feet and performed the somber strains of P.S. Gilmore's The Voice of a Departing Soul. This was the debut of Sousa's new Marine Band on September 26, 1892, but the audience was understandably subdued. A mere 2 days earlier, while at the St. Louis Exposition with his band of 100, Gilmore, who was hailed as the world's greatest bandmaster, unexpectedly died in his hotel room. Upon hearing this stunning news, Sousa wisely made the last-minute change to his program. But even before the downbeat of that stirring piece, at least one newspaper had already declared that, with the passing of Gilmore, Sousa was now the greatest bandmaster in the country. When one examines the careers of these two musical giants during the period from 1885 to 1893, it becomes quite clear that their stories were very much intertwined, with Gilmore unwittingly setting the stage for the rise of Sousa. And while this study is certainly not the first to attempt to explore the colorful and sometimes contentious transition between these legendary bandmasters, it will consider three distinct phases that contributed to the symbolic passing of the baton from the father of the concert band of America to the March King. Phase 1, the era of the Blakeley brothers. Looming large in the stories of both conductors is David Blakeley, the successful businessman and self-proclaimed musical crank, who was also quite tall, 6 feet 4 inches to be exact. He was born to manage a newspaper, it seems, which he did for no less than 8 papers during a period of 29 years. But his first love was music. By 1884, when he was running his 7th paper, he took charge of the Philharmonic Association of Minneapolis, and he set his sights on bringing to their fall music festival P.S. Gilmore and his famous band. 8 years later, David recounted how that came about. He wrote, "When, after several repetitions of my application to Mr. Gilmore to come to Minneapolis, failed to receive any reply, I went all the way to Louisville to have a personal interview with him." And then he recounted their conversation. He wrote, "Gilmore apologized for failing to reply to my letters, and then he said he had no manager. He said, however, that if, after the St. Louis Exposition, which was to replace the Louisville Exposition in 1885, if I would lay out a route for him between St. Louis and Minneapolis and return, he would undertake the enterprise. I thought it over for a while, and being very anxious to get Mr. Gilmore to Minneapolis, I undertook the work as proposed." And so, eventually everything was in place for Gilmore's band to tour its way to the Twin Cities in early November of 1885. And the excitement was at a fever pitch. And while a Blakeley was mentioned as the manager of that tour, it was not David, but rather his older brother Zara, who went by Z. Now, Z had worked for David at the Chicago Evening Post from at least 1867 to 1874, and for the following 10 years served as a railroad agent. He also managed a couple of hotels, and years earlier was an agent for a touring musical group that included his talented and accomplished wife. Most notably, both Z and David toured the country for 5 years when they were younger as part of the Blakeley family, a successful musical group which was managed by their father, from whom they must have learned a great deal about handling life on the road. This combined experience, along with their sibling tie, probably factored into David's arranging for Z to manage Gilmore's band for that fall tour that would bring it to the Twin Cities for the first time. And when it was finished, Gilmore had a new manager, Z. Blakeley, who continued to work in that capacity for the following 6 years. But David's involvement with the great bandmaster is unclear for the next 2 or 3 years. What is clear is that Gilmore's management staff started expanding in 1887, and David was likely behind it. In January, Frank Christianer was listed as an advanced agent. A month later, J.B. Bartlett, who worked closely with David in Minneapolis, was also connected with the staff. By late November, Howard Pugh, a fellow newspaperman who worked under David, had been added as press agent. And by early 1888, J.H. Lane came on board as yet another advance agent. Not all of these men served on every tour, but they, along with Z, and with David eventually at the helm, made up the group that piloted Gilmore's band on its tours from that point on. Now, while Gilmore and his men enjoyed constant adulation, life on the road was not easy in the late 1880s. In a remarkably candid letter to David, who he referred to as "my dear general," the great bandmaster confessed how exhausted he was, and then he took a sarcastic jab at David's comparatively cushy role. Here's what he wrote. "But oh, how happy you must feel simply to sit down in your chair and mail telegrams announcing from various sources thousands upon thousands coming in, while I, your partner, have been going through H, F, and B, which has to be hellfire and brimstone." He goes on to say, "That's all right. You are the right man in the right place, and no matter what the disappointment may be, you have filled the bill nobly." And so, despite the challenges, the partnership worked. But David was not the only Blakeley on the managerial end. Faithfully serving on the road, right alongside Gilmore and his band, was Z, giving attention to every need and detail. And while David received and perhaps created most of the press, it was, as one newspaper said, the Blakeley brothers of Chicago, the men who are known throughout the country through their management of Gilmore's band, that brought this world-class ensemble to new levels of success through its tours. However, it was not to last. Phase 2, the great impresario moves on. At some point after the spring tour of 1891, Gilmore broke with David and his staff and decided to go with an untested impresario or tour organizer for the band's fall tour. The reason for the split is not entirely clear, but there were at least 4 contributing factors. First of all, Z had apparently retired by that time, and perhaps Gilmore felt uneasy about continuing on with just one Blakeley brother. Ample evidence suggests that Z was struggling with depression early in the year, and David chastised him in an ungracious letter. He wrote this: "I do not think you will ever get well so long as you have nothing to do but think of your troubles and make that your chief business." A month later, after Z failed to respond, David's concern grew, and he reminded his brother, quote, "It is going to be something of a task to manage Gilmore this time, and I hope you are in good shape to do it." That same day, David wrote to his brother-in-law in Chicago and asked him to, quote, "Kindly go and see Z at once and report to me. Is he any better or otherwise? Is he able to go with Gilmore and be of any service to us? I haven't heard a word from him in a long time. I wish you would, if possible, get to the bottom of Z's condition and let me know." When Z finally resurfaced in early April and declared that he was good to go, David immediately arranged for the money he would need to come from Chicago to New York to manage Gilmore's spring tour. But it would be his last, whether by his choice or David's. Regardless, at age 64, after he had lost his wife 2 years earlier, Z was now entirely on his own. When David moved on from Gilmore a year later and formed a new band led by Sousa, his older brother was not part of the plan. A second factor coinciding with the split between Gilmore and Blakeley was that David was adding new attractions to his managerial plate around that time, including Strauss's Vienna Orchestra, Theodore Thomas's orchestra, and the Austrian Juvenile Band. But the most significant attraction that David secured for a tour in early 1891, while he was still managing Gilmore, was the United States Marine Band under John Philip Sousa. Now, a few months later, Jules Levy, the celebrated cornetist and conductor, sensing an opportunity, approached David with a plea to make him the next Gilmore. Here's what he wrote. He said, "Why cannot you and I make a deal and you make Levy the future great bandmaster of America? If Gilmore is soon to retire, as I hear he intends doing, why should you not take hold of me and make me as you have him? If you could only do this, I am confident that you would make my fortune as well as fill your coffers." But David declined Levy's request, as he was still in communication with Gilmore about working together again in the near future. While making the arrangements for a second tour of Sousa and his Marine Band, set for the spring of 1892, David corresponded with Gilmore to see what they might do together later that year. And here was his pitch. He wrote, "I am arranging for an irresistible pageant for next year, which you know is the real anniversary of the Columbian discovery. Am I to have Gilmore's band to build upon, or must I organize one of my own?" Well, Gilmore got back to David within days, and the answer was clearly no. But the relationship was not quite over. A mere week later, as he was about to embark on his fall tour, Gilmore wrote to David one last time and revealed that his untested impresario had failed to meet every one of his promises, and Gilmore finally had to take the whole thing off his hands and assume all responsibility himself. And this led the great bandmaster to confess to David, "I miss your master hand in the business department." But then he went on to say why he was not willing to work with him the following year. Here's what he wrote. "Why don't you get up something dignified and grand for Columbus and not waste your fame and genius as a great impresario on a circus of war songs which have not the slightest flavor of musical art and can only arouse false and inartistic enthusiasm for the moment? I would not touch the war song panorama," which was David's proposed pageant, "for any amount of gold. I will go into anything with you that has sublime music as its aim and basis." Well, that last line led David to make a final attempt to restore his relationship with Gilmore. He wrote, "You say, I will go into anything with you that has sublime music as its aim and basis. Do you mean by that you wish to resume the old relation at the end of this tour? I would be glad of your simple answer, yes or no." Once again, the answer was no. This clash of artistic visions was the third factor leading to the end of their partnership. One final factor, which may have been the proverbial last straw, came in October of 1891 when Gilmore told David of his plan to tour with a monster band the following year. Here's what he wrote. He said, "I will give concerts in cities that can bear it with the full band of 100 members. And I'll bet you an even $5,000 that I will make it pay big money." Well, perhaps David should have taken that bet. As he explained to Gilmore's wife a few years later, he said, "We canvassed the subject of a band of 100 fully, and I made an estimate of the cost of the tour and showed him what seemed to me convincing reasons why I would not dare join him in the enterprise." And so, no longer with Gilmore, and after an even more lucrative second tour with a Marine Band, David Blakeley, that great impresario as Gilmore had called him, moved on and formed a new band under the relatively young Sousa that would rival the one led by the seasoned leader with whom he had just parted ways. The expectation of making money was clearly driving the new venture, for as David put it bluntly to Sousa, "We are in this thing for glory and money." But how would they pull it off with Gilmore and the greatest band in the world still in the field? Well, the answer would surprise everyone. Phase 3, the timely or perhaps untimely death of a living legend. David already had an experienced staff to manage the new band, consisting of Pugh and Christianer and Bartlett. Lane had remained with Gilmore. What was needed now were top players, and by late August, Sousa had received over 500 applications. Significantly, some of those interested were active members of Gilmore's band, and David welcomed 4 of them prior to the band's first tour. And while this led to concerns about poaching players from other bands, David made this strong statement the following year. He wrote, I desire most emphatically to say that I never made an overture to any one of Gilmore's men before he died, either directly or indirectly, except upon the proviso of his own consent. And so, with the band coming together, the next order of business was to finalize concert appearances for the coming months. But then tragedy struck. 18 days into Gilmore's highly anticipated residency at the St. Louis Exposition with his colossal band of 100, the legendary bandmaster died. Feeling ill on the morning of September 24th, he asked his longtime assistant director, Charles Freudenthal, to direct the 4 concerts that day. And during the third one, a message from Gilmore's daughter, Minnie, arrived at the manager's office in the music hall, and it simply read, "Papa is dead." He had expired of heart failure. The following day, the entire front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch provided the details of this terrible loss. And when the band was finally told, the article said, the announcement fell with a crushing force, and several members of the band burst into tears and left the stage. Gilmore's sudden death occurred just 2 days before the launch of Sousa's rival band, prompting David to publish this thoughtful response. He wrote, "The announcement of the sudden death of Mr. Gilmore has been received by none with deeper or more profound regret than by Mr. John Philip Sousa, his fellow bandmaster and friend, and by me, who was for years his only business manager. Neither of us can express in words the loss which the country and the cause of music has experienced by his untimely decease." Now, there's little doubt that David accurately represented his new leader's heart toward Gilmore. But David's actions in the following days suggest that he was more of a callous opportunist than a grieving friend. The New York Times reported that, and I quote, "2 days after Mr. Gilmore's funeral, manager Blakeley, who conducted the Gilmore tour 2 years ago, called on Mrs. Gilmore at her residence and offered to purchase the musical library of the dead leader. It would be of great value to Mr. Blakeley, who would, by its purchase, secure just what he needs for his new Marine band and get rid of a rival on the concert field." However, the plan was for Gilmore's band to continue, and in mid-October, a committee appointed by the band elected the respected bandmaster D.W. Reeves to be Gilmore's successor. Although Mrs. Gilmore declined the purchase of Gilmore's library, David made 2 other opportunistic moves. First, concerning the recruitment of members of Gilmore's band, he later expressed that after Mr. Gilmore's death, the case was entirely changed, as he felt entitled at that point to go after them, given that he was so long Gilmore's manager. But the interest likely went both ways, especially given David's second move, that of arranging for Sousa to take over Gilmore's annual residencies at Manhattan Beach and St. Louis that following year. Consequently, by mid-February of 1893, 14 former Gilmore players were now enrolled amongst the stars of the Sousa galaxy, and soon after that, 3 more joined them, bringing the total to 17. Reeves, who at this point was thoroughly frustrated, fired off an emotionally charged circular titled, "An Open Letter to Whom It May Concern, Gilmore's Band Speaks." In it, he referred to unscrupulous parties, including a man whom Mr. Gilmore repudiated for reasons, clearly David, but no names were mentioned, who had created a new band for the avowed purpose of running Mr. Gilmore from the field. And then he added that this man made progress toward his goal in part by securing, quote, "a few fossiled and worn-out members of Gilmore's band." Well, the editors of the Musical Courier, who had published the circular, called Reeves' attack a thrust of equally bad taste and bad business tact, as well as a wrathful plaint and an effusion of resentment, and added that the public will not justify anyone in speaking of such thoroughly competent musicians as those who joined Sousa as fossiled and worn-out members of Gilmore's band. Most importantly, 11 of those so-called fossiled and worn-out members who had joined the new band crafted and signed a thorough response to Reeves, which concluded with this statement: "Gilmore's band is now not only destitute of its late brilliant and lamented leader, but most of the soloists who aided him in making it famous, and of the engagement which had been so long identified with his successful career. These soloists and these engagements being now in possession of Sousa's band, and its management being the same as that which piloted Gilmore so successfully through the last 5 years of his great career, it would seem as if the question might be an open one, whether Sousa's organization, if he wished it, could not lay greater title to being Gilmore's band." When Gilmore died, the Chicago Tribune declared, and I quote, "At the present time, there is no one in this country who is so imbued with such great gifts and is so essentially American in national love and real patriotism who can take his place." The Metronome added, quote, "The world waited a long time for Mr. P.S. Gilmore, and it may be many years before we find another so true, so warm-hearted, and so popular a leader." Both reports were fitting tributes to Patrick Sarsfield Gilmore, but neither of them anticipated John Philip Sousa taking his place in such a short amount of time, while David Blakeley somehow did. Writing to the young bandmaster in early 1892, just over a month before his second tour with the U.S. Marine Band, David peered into the future and said this to Sousa: "One of these days, when the great and good Gilmore has done with terrestrial music, he may want to put Sousa at the head of his band. I think there would be a better opportunity for you than even the Marine affords." Of course, when he wrote that, David had no idea how the circumstances would play out to make something like that happen. But in the end, they played out perfectly. What if David hadn't pulled in his older brother Z to manage Gilmore's band in 1885? Or if he hadn't assembled that world-class management staff in 1887? Or if he and Gilmore hadn't clashed in their artistic visions for a pageant in early 1892? Or disagreed about touring with a band of 100? And what if David hadn't been so opportunistic and driven by glory and money? And finally, most importantly, what if Gilmore hadn't suddenly died just 2 days before Sousa launched his new Marine Band? All of these circumstances, quite unintentionally, led to one legendary bandmaster giving rise to another, and we should remember and celebrate them both.